Evet, soru almaya başlayabiliriz.
Okay, we can start taking questions. Yes, Muammer Bey, let's start with you. My name is Muammer Keskin. I am representing TÜSES. I would like to thank Thomas for all his explanations. Actually, we know the subject matter, but we have seen once again how immense the problem is after seeing it at hand of figures. Two questions. What can Thomas say in order to remedy the situation? Because on the one hand, we have an organized power, and on the other hand, we have the poor people. With regard to the organization of the poor populations vis-à-vis the organized powers, how can we achieve that? Secondly, you mentioned taxation. Taxation is one of your expert areas. With regard to global capital, they are in mobility with regard to taxation. But regarding the tax havens and tax justice, at least can we organize this group of people, because ensuring justice regarding taxation, it is not only the governments that are responsible to do that, but sometimes the indirect taxes are very important. And when we compare the situation with the rest of the world, we see that the taxes paid by the poor population of the world is higher than the rest. Could you elaborate on that, please? We shall collect the questions, and you will be responding at the very end, if that is okay with you. Adil Bey and then Tamer Bey. Hello. I would like to thank the professor. It was a very enlightening presentation. My question will be related to a very, very up-to-date problem. Namely, there is a major migration from the area where Turkey is situated towards the Western European countries. And this causes a major drama. Many people have to abandon their countries, their land, in order to find a better life elsewhere. So they are on the move. Regarding this migration issue, right now, the international organizations like the European Union, the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, we did not have any positive reaction. And in the coming months, we will have the meeting series of the United Nations. What can be done regarding this human drama, because the Mediterranean has become a graveyard for all these migrants? Do you have any information about whether there will be any moves on the part of the United Nations to remedy the situation? I also thank for the presentation. My name is Hüseyin Çakır. I will have two questions. First question. Regarding the law on wars, regarding the violation of human rights in a war environment, Professor Pogge did not make any comments on this issue. What is the international position of humanitarian law with regard to the areas under in war? Second question. One of the major reasons for the inequality in the world, you said that this is due to the economic conditions. Many economists have discussed the minimum and maximum revenues in the world, and could you please share your views on that issue at greater length? Thank you. My name is Turan Sarıtemur. Professor Pogge mentioned in general economic inequality. With regard to the human rights justice, right now in the Iraqi, Iranian and Turkish Kurdistan, the people living in those regions, who is responsible locally and globally for the situation prevailing in all these three areas where the Kurdish people are living? My name is Hüseyin Antaş. Global poverty and social and economic rights. These are the main areas of expertise of Professor Pogge. But there was a question, and there was something that confused me during the presentation of Professor Pogge. You mentioned migration, and when and I think Professor Pogge does not see migration as a solution to the prevailing problems. But he emphasized the elimination of poverty based on economic reasons. Well, now I would like to continue in English, says the speaker.
The shift from national law to supranational law made it more easy for the ones in power and who are more affluent to be able to make more lobbying, and this made disadvantages for us. So I have read some professors suggesting that it would be much better if there would be a global administrative law system for the best of the refugees in international refugee law. But if it would be more easy for the more affluent ones, which have different intentions, to affect this supranational law, would it be advantageous for us to ask or demand for a global administrative law legal system or not? This is my first question. And it would be very nice if you could talk a little bit about global resources dividend, which GRD, which you suggest, maybe because it was the lecture had to finish earlier than I suppose, so maybe it would be more influencing for us. Thank you very much.
Şu çağrıya. Başka kaçırdığım biri var mı?
Çağrı Mutaf, Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'nden.
Çağrı Mutat from Bosphorus University. I have two questions, two issues that were not mentioned during the presentation. The first issue, we know that in war conditions or in extreme poverty situations, women are more disadvantaged than men. We know that, and there are many figures proving that, be it in international wars or regional wars. Do you have any solution? Can you recommend any solution to this situation, or do you have any arguments? And obviously, the second issue is the role of religion in such inequalities. religion, do you think that religion can does function as a mechanism that increases the impact of such conditions? Second condition, the global. You said that you asked Professor Roth whether that theory can be globally applied or not, and he said that this was not possible, and this is only for closed systems. Do you still think in these same lies, or do you have another view now?
Nihat Boztepe.
Nihat Boztepe. I would like to thank Professor Pogge for this realistic presentation. Yes, it's not very pleasant what we heard, but this is the reality of our contemporary lives. Are there again UN mechanisms that by which they govern certain states, and together with the current economic system, the states, vis-à-vis the rules that were idealized by the International Declaration of Human Rights, what type of a mechanism can we produce or come up with, because the present economic system is eroding what the rules and the principles of human rights have foreseen. Are there any new proposals on your part to remedy this situation? Ülker Demir. Well, my question to the professor is as follows. Don't we blame capitalism at all? Yes, these are all the questions that we have collected, and Professor Pogge, you may now answer those questions.
similar things could now destabilizing the situation in Syria. And so I think that the American decisions to go into these countries certainly contributed to the destabilization, to the problems there. But on the other hand, one has to say that the Kurds' situation before, under Saddam Hussein, for example, was not exactly a pleasant situation either. So there were significant human rights violations that Saddam Hussein committed against the Kurds, famously gassing whole towns and so forth. And so the Kurds may, if things go reasonably well, come out of the present crisis with a better situation than they had before, with a sort of semi-autonomous region in Iraq, where they have income from oil and have the capacity to govern themselves autonomously and protect themselves. They'll probably not get a state, but at least they get an autonomous region there. Now, one question was, that was I think your question, the question about if we look for international solutions, are we not thereby making it easier for the global elites to dominate the content of those solutions? So that's a complicated question. I think we should not take for granted that global rules have to be shaped always by the elites. To the contrary, we should try to fight that as much as possible. We should not only fight at the level of the content of the rules, namely try to make these rules juster than they currently are, but we should also fight at the level of the decisions about the rules in favor of more democratic rule making. So I'm not an opponent of globalization, despite everything that I said. I think that we need globalization. The problems and challenges that humanity is facing in the next century require global rules, global coordination, global governance. The problem is that this global governance has to be democratized. We have to have mechanisms of decision-making at the global level that make it possible for ordinary citizens to be involved in these decisions, to supervise these decisions. Now, how can we achieve that? I think there are maybe three things to be said. The first thing is the European Union is an interesting experiment of supranational rulemaking, and so we can learn a great deal from both the successes and the failures of the European Union. The European Union, of course, has a huge democratic deficit. The Parliament is weak, the Commission is strong, and it has all the problems that I outlined for the world at large, for the WTO, for example, and so on. Namely that the big corporations in the EU have the possibility of lobbying the EU Commission, and ordinary citizens, the vast majority of Europe, has very little chance to influence decision-making by the European Commission. We do have the European Parliament, but the European Parliament is very weak. Parliaments traditionally control the money, they control the budget, and the budget of the European Union is very small. It doesn't have much of an independent budget. Most of the money is given by the individual governments and spent and controlled by the individual governments. So, but this can all change. The Parliament can become more powerful. It has become more powerful. And we have to struggle within the European Union to democratize these common institutions. I am, in principle, a supporter of a united Europe. I think it's a good idea, certainly after all the wars and the bloodshed that has happened in the 20th century. But we have to democratize it, and I think there is significant pressure, moral pressure, citizen pressure, towards democratizing the European Union. So I see the European Union, for all its flaws, still as a somewhat hopeful experiment that can show the way towards what might happen more broadly at the global level. Even though, of course, it's much harder at the global level because the inequalities are so great, but economic inequalities in particular. Now, the two steps at the global level, I think the first step is an increasing juridification. We need stronger courts, because courts, even though they are not democratic, courts at least are imposing a certain discipline of consistency on decision-making. A court has to apply the same rules to powerful countries and to weak countries. And that, in principle, that the rules have that sort of uniform application, that already is a certain equalization as opposed to, for example, decision-making through political channels, where, of course, no consistency requirement is imposed. So the International Criminal Court, I think, is a step in the right direction, and we should have greater use of courts more broadly. For example, we should have a court that decides whether humanitarian intervention is permissible in a particular situation or not. Looking at human rights standards, it can decide whether the situation in Iraq, let's say, is one in which systematic gross violations of human rights occur or not, and whether it's a situation in which intervention is permitted or not. That would be much better for a court to decide than for the Security Council or for individual countries or for NATO or somebody like that. And then as a second step, we should have a parliament. A UN parliament is not realistic today. It would be very fiercely resisted, certainly by the permanent members of the Security Council. But in the long run, that is exactly what we need. We need some sort of a democratic decision mechanism, at first maybe with limited competences, but one that could then grow in power and influence, just as I hope the European Parliament will grow in power and influence. The disadvantage of women in war, I mean, disadvantage is putting it very mildly. I mean, women suffer immensely in war, of course, and they're often, raped and violated in many ways. They have to protect the children, which is often a very difficult thing to do in a war situation. And looking at recent wars, the suffering that women in particular experienced was horrendous in the Congo, for example, but also now in the Syria-Iraq theater of operations. It's quite horrendous. Now, what can be done? I think that the most important thing that can be done is to try to make these war situations less frequent, right? We have to settle our differences without violence. The next big step of civilization in this world of ours has to be the attempt to exclude violence as a means of settling conflicts. We have achieved that within states. Within at least some states, violence has become completely irrelevant. The capacity for violence has become completely irrelevant. If I, in Germany or in the United States, the States, there is a lot of violence, but let's say Germany, if I have a dispute with my neighbor, then that dispute gets settled regardless of whether I'm big and strong or small and weak, and regardless of whether I have a gun or a knife or something. All of that doesn't matter. Everybody gets treated equally by the law, and that's how it should be, right? The potential for violence, the capacity to use violence should not matter at all in settling the conflicts that will necessarily occur among human beings. Now that's what we need in the world. We are living in a dangerous world in which weapons are getting more and more dangerous. More and more countries have very dangerous weapons. And we have to get rid of this way of settling conflicts through violence. And we have to do so quickly if we want to survive as a species without provoking World War III. The problem in achieving that is that some countries derive a lot of their political power from their military power, from their capacity for violence. There are 5 countries in particular that are very strong militarily and who would lose a lot of political power if military power were abolished. And that's the US, Israel, Russia, North Korea, and Pakistan. Those are the typical countries that rely for their political strength predominantly on military capacity. The US would be much weaker in the world today if violence became irrelevant. The same is true of Pakistan, the same is true of North Korea, the same is true of Israel, and the same is true of Russia. And so these countries have a very strong interest in keeping violence in play. Not necessarily in using violence, but they have an interest in violence being still on everybody's mind, being a constant possibility. If violence is a constant possibility, then I want to be friends with the Americans. I want to be nice to them because I may need them, or with the Russians, or with the Chinese, whatever. So that's the point, and that's why I think this is in many ways the hardest problem for humanity to solve. We need to overcome the use of systematic violence, and we need to do it in this century, but I cannot be optimistic that this can be achieved because there is just this very strong interest that a certain number of powers have in keeping violence relevant, keeping the capacity for violence relevant. The role of religion, it's hard to answer that in general terms. So religion can be a strong ideological force in favor of the status quo. It can often get people used to the status quo, get them to accept the status quo. For example, in the Christian religion, you have this idea that those people who are poor in this earth, they will go to heaven, they will have a better life in the after death. And that sort of a slogan, of course, has inclined many people to say, well, I'm poor, but it doesn't really matter, I will be better off in heaven. So, and every religion can be used and has been used in this defense of the status quo sort of way. But religions can also be quite critical, and critical not just in a revolutionary way as now is seen with Islam in ISIS, where it is used to justify violence and in fact quite brutal violence, but it can also be used critically. So the Christian Pope recently put out an encyclical where he spoke out very, actually quite intelligently and quite elaborately on climate change, said that we have to do something to stop climate change. And that was a very sophisticated and interesting statement by a religious leader that was peaceful and yet very critical of the status quo. And I think it was something that covered new ground. He also spoke out against inequality and against poverty, so in this way plays a positive role. And of course there are religious spokespeople in Islam and in other religions who are playing a similar sort of role. To give an Islamic example, the emir of Kano, which is a very high Islamic official in Nigeria, a guy called Sunusi, is very instrumental in Nigeria in getting people to accept vaccinations, in trying to democratize the country, and so on. Is a very enlightened religious leader in Nigeria, which is a country in which, of course, you also have lunatics roaming, the Boko Haram people roaming around, killing people, kidnapping women, and so on and so forth. So religion can play a role for evil, it can play a role for good, it can play a conservative role, it can play a progressive role. And I think it's very much worthwhile to debate within each religion, to debate and to try to win those people who are religious in favor of an enlightened and democratic path towards progress. I have two more things, but we can just, because you look like time is up.
Time is up.
Good.
Time is up, I think. Çok teşekkürler katılın.
We thank you very much for your participation.
There's only one more point, the Walls point that we can.
It was till 7 o'clock. It's